Well, thank you for having me here. I'm going to present the fiscal and monetary history of Colombia. This is joint work with Daniel Osorio Rodriguez from the Central Bank. So the hypothesis of this project is that bad fiscal and monetary policies led to macroeconomic instability in Latin America, and that this macroeconomic instability was responsible for the low growth and poor economic performance. However, when we look at the Colombian data, we actually see that this doesn't necessarily hold. So in fact, in Colombia, what we see is that there were not so bad fiscal and monetary policies. I don't want to call them good, but at least they were not so bad. And actually, we have in Colombia relative macroeconomic stability. However, this macroeconomic stability did not lead to growth or to good economic performance. So just to highlight the second point, if we look at the GDP growth of Colombia, what we find is that in Colombia there have been very few recessions. So actually, in the sample we're studying, there was only 1 year with negative growth. It was in 1999, and the growth was about -4%. The whole other years, growth was positive, and even in the beginning of the 80s, when many Latin American countries were going through a harsh economic performance, GDP in Colombia grew by 1%. And if we look through the whole 20th century, there have only been 3 years with negative growth in Colombia. And the 2 other years were during the Great Depression. And the other thing that we see that is kind of opposite to other countries in Latin America is that even though there was high and persistent inflation, there weren't any periods of hyperinflation. So in fact, in the whole sample we're studying, inflation was never above 35% in a given year. However, if we compare the economic performance in Colombia, it wasn't that good. So in this graph, I'm showing GDP per capita, and we see that Colombia actually lags behind many other countries in Latin America. And even though it has grown a little bit, it's not necessarily catching up. So our hypothesis for this part of Colombia is that one of the reasons why in Colombia we don't see bad policies is because for most of the sample we're studying, Colombia had a small government. And even in the periods even when the economic institutions were set such that there could be, for instance, periods of hyperinflation, in Colombia used financial repression, and that actually helped to avoid hyperinflation, but that also may be the cause of the low economic growth. So in this project, what we do is we characterize the joint history of monetary and fiscal policy following the general framework. And in general for Colombia, what we find is that the government financed itself using a different source in different periods. So in the first period, what we find is that the government financed its deficit mainly through foreign debt. In the second period, mainly through monetary emission, and in the third period, mainly through domestic debt. So I'm going to highlight the fact that 1991 was a special year in Colombia because in that year the economic institutions changed by a lot. So before 1991 in Colombia, there was a monetary board. The monetary board was the authority, the credit and monetary authority, and it had no independence from the government. And during this period, the central bank basically worked as a development bank. And this caused that there was increasing tolerance towards inflation, but there were never periods of hyperinflation because in this period, financial repression, and in particular reserve requirements, were used to counteract this. And well, also before 1991, there was various forms of armed conflict, but that also holds after 1991. In 1991, there was a huge change because there was a new constitution, and with this new constitution, the central bank became independent with an explicit objective of low inflation. So 1991 basically splits the economic history in Colombia in two, at least for the samples we're studying. So in the framework we're using is, we're starting by analyzing the budget constraint of the government. So on the right-hand side, we see the fiscal deficit, and what we're going to do is analyze how the fiscal deficit was financed, either through domestic debt, foreign debt, or monetary emission. And we're going to treat these transfers as the residual. So what we're going to focus on is on the national central government. And the reason why we focus on the national central government is that, well, first of all, because we have availability of data that is reliable, but also because when we see local governments, what we see is that their main source of revenue is transferred from the national central government. So in Colombia, the local governments, they can levy some taxes, but it doesn't account for much in the revenue. The main source is transfers from the central government. And also the local governments, they can issue some debt, but not many do. And when they do, they're constrained by law. So they cannot issue above certain percentage of their income in a given year. So when we see data of the debt of local governments, it only represents around 3%. So with respect to debt, we went to divide the debt into categories. The first one is going to be domestic, and what we're going to call domestic debt is debt issued in Colombia. This debt issued in Colombia is mostly in Colombian pesos. And what we're going to call foreign is debt issued abroad, which is mostly in US dollars. So there has been, this division is because of the data we have, but actually there have been some studies. In particular, there's this paper by Du and Schreiber, Du from the Federal Reserve Board and Schreiber from Harvard. And they find that in Colombia, of the debt we call domestic, so of the debt issued in Colombia, a maximum around 15% is in the hands of foreigners. And there doesn't seem to be evidence that Colombians hold debt issued by the government abroad. So my point with this is that this division isn't going to be very arbitrary, and isn't going to be very different if we use other definitions of domestic and foreign debt. For index, we only have data for index government debt until very recently, and it's also very small. So that's why we abstract from it, and so the part that is indexed, we're going to include it in domestic. And also with respect to debt, we have information of implied interest rates. Unfortunately, we don't have information until very recently of the marginal rate of debt. So when we see debt in Colombia, so in this picture I'm showing debt in constant dollars. And here I just want to highlight a couple of things. The first one is that until the mid-90s, the majority of the debt was foreign, this red line. The other thing is that since the mid-90s, there was a huge surge in debt. Debt increased by a lot. And also in that point, domestic debt started playing a more important role. And in fact, recently, while domestic debt has increased, foreign debt is actually decreasing a little bit. If we see this as a percentage of GDP, what we find is that through most of the history we're analyzing, through the 90s, basically debt didn't represent much of GDP. The main reason is because the government was small. And then in the mid-90s, it increased, and now it's around 40%. And the majority is domestic debt. So if we adjust by the real exchange rate, so here I just want to highlight that by adjusting by the real exchange rate just makes debt to represent a little bit over 50% in a given year. But since foreign debt has become a less important part, basically adjusting the debt by real exchange rate and it doesn't change much the picture. So what we're going to call monetary emission is also going to change depending on. So before 1991, what we call monetary emission is going to be net credit from the central bank to the government. And it also includes these special exchange accounts, which I'll go into detail in the next slide. And after 1991, monetary emission is just going to represent the profits from the central bank.
Is this just an accounting issue? What is?
No, because after 1991, it's very hard for the central bank to lend to the government directly, and it hasn't happened yet.
Oh, so you're saying that the first bullet that you have prior to 1991, it had to become zero by law after 1991 or something like that?
Yes, exactly, yes. So basically, the only resources that the central bank can transfer the central bank can transfer to the government are its profits. But before it wasn't the case. Before actually the central bank lent directly to the government. So and these special exchange accounts are just before 1991 they were important, and the part of this. Who sells the government bonds? There's the primary market are the biggest commercial banks. So these special exchange accounts, they include two components. The first one is profits or losses from the management of foreign exchange, and there was also this component on taxes. And so this part would correspond to monetary emission. This part doesn't correspond to monetary emission. This part we don't. We follow these guys, And these guys, what they do is that they include that part in the income of the government. So that doesn't correspond to monetary emission. So the part we're including as monetary emission is just the profits or losses from managing the exchange rate. So so these exchange rates, they were managed by the central bank, but the central bank gave the resources to the government. The thing is that of what that central bank gave, so those, let's say these were $100. The $100, the central bank, they gave it to the government at the end of the period, of the year. But of those $100, 50 were taxes. So those 50 doesn't represent monetary emission. Those 50 represent just income of the government. Yes, exactly. Well, we don't. These guys do. Okay. But we follow them. Exactly. We use the data.
What's the size of the black market? And do you think it's constant relative to the official accounts?
Of the foreign exchange market, you mean, or?
The drug.
Okay. Well, no, this point is small. So when there was a big deal in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s.
What's a big deal
relative to the violence that we had to live daily? I mean, so in economic terms, well, I don't know the exact number, but it was significant. But I mean, it wasn't. I mean, it was less than 10. Well, I would guess around 10%. I mean, it wasn't a half for sure. But that was during the climax. I mean, like nowadays, it's not a big deal. No, I know that in the beginning of the 90s, there was a separate account for GDP that included drug dealing. So we use different data sources. So in this graph, I'm showing the size of the government in percent of GDP. So what I want to highlight here is that until the 90s, beginning of the 90s, the government was small. It was never above 7%. The expenditures of the government were never above 7% of GDP. Beginning in 1991 actually, with the Constitution, the size of the government began to increase. Here I'm showing the fiscal deficit. I just want to highlight here that the fiscal deficit, I just want to highlight here the 3 cycles I mentioned before. So this was the first cycle.
Includes interest payments.
Yes, yeah, this is the fiscal deficit, not the primary deficit. Although, until the 90s, since the government was small and debt was also small, basically the fiscal deficit was only the primary deficit. It was beginning in the 90s that the interest rate payments began to play a bigger role.
Do you have a picture of debt to GDP?
Yeah,
This goes from the middle of the 90s. Like in 5 years, it goes from 10% of GDP to 40 something. And I was expecting to understand why. The difference on the primary surpluses are not that. How do you explain that 30% increase in debt to GDP?
So there was 2 things. In 1991, with the Constitution, I can. It's a short answer. So it's 2 periods. Two reasons. The first thing is that there was the domestic market. The government started developing a market for domestic debt. So that actually also explains this surge in the blue line. And the other thing was that Colombia opened its current account in 1991.
The answer should be on the start. The deficit were for so many years, so much of GDP, and you compound those, you get to.
Yeah, that's what I was expecting.
Okay. Like that calculation.
Why the deficits were just as an accounting.
Yeah, that's that. Yeah, my word.
Okay. So I see. As you were saying. Okay. So I have. So I mean, so
4%. You get 4%, 5, 6. That gives me 15 plus 7 is 20 something, and then you get 40% increase. That's. But I don't know. Maybe it will come in the residual.
What about the
Sorry.
What about the foreign reserves of the central bank? Maybe they buying foreign reserves.
Yeah, maybe this.
Oh yeah, and actually foreign reserves started increasing by a lot. So it might be foreign exchange reserves. It might be. I'll take a look at that. Yeah. So here I'm showing how the government financed that deficit, and I want to highlight the 3 cycles I mentioned. Here the black line would be the primary deficit. So I want to highlight first that in this period, foreign debt was the main source of financing for the deficit. In this period, it was monetary emission. And then in this period, the black line is the highest of all, and that's domestic debt. And that's what defines the 3 periods that we're mentioning. Okay, so yeah, here I'm showing inflation. Okay, so here I'm going to start with the periods, going through the periods now. But before I go into it all with the periods, I just want to highlight one thing, and is that we start our analysis in 1963, and that's also the year where we see the highest inflation of all the sample. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to try to understand what happened in 1963. So the reason for this inflation could be, so the 50s weren't easy in Colombia, and one of the reasons was because in the 50s we had the only military dictatorship in the 20th century. It was a short one, but it was still a military dictatorship. And in the early 50s, what we see was a huge rise in the price of coffee, at a time where coffee represented about 70% of exports. So with this huge rise and with the military dictatorship, there came a fiscal and monetary expansion, but that started to reverse in the late part of that decade because the price of coffee came down in part. And also in 1961, there was this law, this fiscal reform that decreased the tax revenues and increased the government expenditures. So that led to an increase in the deficit, which we also see in data. And I know this happened. I'm not sure how to check if this is what the cost inflation. But in 1962, beginning of 1963, there was a huge strike in Colombia, and that led to a rise in around 25% of wages. So that might be a main reason why inflation surged, why inflation increased so much that year. So we begin with the first cycle we find. So this cycle is the smallest of the cycles we analyze, in the sense that in this cycle the deficit peaked at 1.2% of GDP. During this cycle, financing was mainly done through foreign debt, and it begins with the establishment of the monetary board, and it ends before a huge coffee boom that Colombia had in the 70s. So the monetary board was established in 1963, and it was established as the foreign exchange, monetary, and credit authority. And it lasted until 1990. It lasted from 1963 to 1990. So the reason it was established was because since the beginning of the central bank was established in 1923, and since 1923 until 1963, the private sector had a lot of influence in the decisions. So the government decided that it wanted to play a bigger role in the authority, and also since the 50s, the central bank started to get involved actively in the credit markets. So the government didn't want to let that only in the hands of the private sector, so it decided to. Sorry?
So in 1963, there was like a board that was composed by people from the private sector. So
from 1923 to 1963, yeah, there was the board of the central bank, and the private sector had chairs in that board. It had the majority, actually. There was government representative, but the majority was private sectors. So the way the central bank was established was that they thought that it was thought that there should be a representative of each of the economic sectors in the board. And beginning in 1963, that changed. And in 1963, then the monetary board was established, and the members were ministers, and there was the head of the central bank, and there were two advisors. And I mention this because in Colombia, it is thought that these two advisors played a big role. These two advisors were the only independent members, in the sense that they weren't part of the government. They didn't have a vote, but they did take part in the discussions. And actually, these advisors were the main characters in economic policy in the 80s and 90s. So these advisors. These two advisors at the same time, but of the many advisors that there were, many became ministers and head of the central bank, and the guys I would like to invite when we do the meeting in Colombia. Okay. So during this period, inflation started to increase. So it became from this high in 1963, and they started slowly to increase, but there was an increased tolerance towards inflation, and the main reason for that was because real wages never went down. And there was a lot of, also in the 60s, a lot of indexation started to happen in the economy. So basically everything started to come to increase. The prices of everything started to increase at the same pace of inflation. Wages increased by more. And in this period, the financing was mainly done through foreign debt, which is this red line. This black line is the fiscal deficit.
So you're computing this transfer, the green line, as a difference.
Yes.
It gives you exactly 0.
Yes. For these years, we rely on the data of these guys that separate the monetary component from the fiscal component of these special accounts. And they are able to identify.
We are identifying the way they computed the data.
Yes. Yes, I've double checked for some years.
Do you know which is the one they computed as a residual?
You mean after?
Clearly, this guy computing one of the terms of the restriction as a residual. That's why when you compute the residual, you get a 0.
Yeah.
Ah, okay, I see. No, I don't know. I'll double check. Yes, so I mean, these guys rely on the budget that is published by on the budget of the central of the government that as it was published by the central bank every month, and I've compared it, and it looks similar. The only difference would be I would claim that the only difference I would find was because these guys are able to of these special accounts, they're able to determine which is monetary component and which is income for the government.
They are forcing it to be. So you're not computing the delta M over Y with data on money.
No, I'm using by how it was financed.
That'll be interesting to do.
As a double check. Okay. Okay.
I mean, there is an independent measure of money, right?
Yes. Yes, there is. In general, for what I'm going to show today, I'm relying on how it was financed. I'm not relying on these calculations that I'm showing is how it was financed. No, how the money changed or how debt increased. I'm just.
But see, then if you made so in a way, it's delta M over Y that's his residual.
Probably.
And so if he gets direct measures of M,
There's going to be.
then he could make T over Y be the residual, and it wouldn't be 0 anymore.
Yeah.
I could do that as a double check. Okay.
There's an old paper that Dornbush and Fisher wrote 30 years ago on moderate inflation. Colombia is like one of the 3 or 4 countries in the world that ever had inflation between 15 and 30 for a long, long time. And they thought it was mostly seniorage that was going on.
Yeah. So in the period where that happened was from the 70s, late 70s to the 90s, and actually, yeah, that's consistent with what we find. That it was monetary emission was the main source of financing in that period, which will be the next period I'm going to show. So this main financing came mostly from loans from multilateral entities, and we can see that these loans were mainly at a low interest rate. This is the implied. So there would be the marginal the marginal debt, but the marginal interest rate. So I mean, we get this from the actual payments of that. So in this period, government was small. Where the expenditures of the government fluctuated between 4.5 and 7% of GDP.
You know how another revenues from the rest of the state is 6% of GDP. It's really small.
The government was small. No, actually, local governments are even smaller. I mean, they don't we only mention central government because most of the things that happen with local governments come from the central government. So most of their most important income, majority of its income is from transfer from the central government and all that. Yeah, that's why we claim that this might be one of the reasons why monetary policy didn't explode or fiscal policy didn't explode because the government was mainly small. So in this period, foreign exchange policy had a big change in 1967. So before that, there were multiple foreign exchange. In 1967, there was a reform, and there were capital controls, tight capital controls were established, and a crawling peg began. So this crawling peg, implicitly, the idea of the crawling peg was to have a constant real exchange rate. Although they never said it, but it seems in this period at least that real exchange rate fluctuated around.
You say that there are multiple exchange rates. Which one are you showing here?
I'm showing here the one that the central bank gave to importers, which is the one the central bank reports.
There are the measures of the black market.
I've tried to look. Okay, so but I mean the black market became a deal here, but I haven't found measures of the black market. For these ones, yeah, there are many measures. I just took the one the central bank reports which is the one for imports.
The crawling peg was only for, there was also a dual exchange system.
No. The dual was before 1967. After 1967, there was a crawling peg. There must be a black market. Only I don't know the data. Because there was a tight capital controls. Yeah, actually, there are stories that there was this guy that came to a central bank when the people in the central bank needed money, and everybody knew this guy, and he came going desk by desk selling dollars at a time when the central bank was establishing the capital controls. But I haven't found data about the black market rate. Okay, so in the second period, goes from 1976 to 1991. In this period, financing was mainly done through monetary emission. This period begins with a huge rise in the price of coffee, and ends with the promulgation of the new constitution in 1991. And I just want to highlight here that the 80s weren't so much of a lost decade for Colombia, in the sense that, in general, the GDP grew every year, and it grew by an average of 3.3%. So the reason we begin this period in 1976 is because the price of coffee, so this was the rise in the price of coffee that I showed a couple of slides before in the 50s. The rise of coffee in 1976, the price increased by 7 times. And in this time, coffee represented around 60% of the exports. In this period, so we're talking, this period, there was still a crawling peg. So at the time where there was all these dollars coming into the economy, there was still a crawling peg, and the president at the time even declared that the boom is for coffee growers. So what he meant was the crawling peg was meant to be to avoid an appreciation of the dollar, so that led to a real appreciation. And that might be a reason why there was high persistent inflation. Here. Yeah, so at the time where the price of coffee increased a lot, at a time where coffee was one of the main sources of income for dollars, a lot of dollars were coming to the economy, but there was a crawling peg, there was a fixed exchange rate. And the dollar couldn't go down. It was going up, so that led to a real appreciation, and that might be a reason why there was high persistent inflation in this part.
So the real appreciation couldn't be achieved by a drop in the nominal exchange rate, so they had to go by price.
Inflation.
Yeah.
Inflation.
So I'm sorry to be a pain on this, but I'm looking at the table in Dornbusch and Fisher. They say that the early 80s is debt accumulation. So they say that you added 15% of debt to GDP between 80 and 84. Yeah, so they say.
But look, if you forget the late '90s, that's the biggest, right?
Yeah,
so
but they say the level is 44% in 1984 of debt to GDP. The debt to GDP ratio rose from 28% in 1980 to 44% in 1985. That's what. I don't know.
Is that for public sector, or you're taking only central government?
I'm taking central government, yes. I don't know, but it's still. I mean, the public sector shouldn't be twice as big. So during this period, until the beginning of the 80s, there was this real appreciation. After the 80s, during the 80s, there was a steeper nominal devaluation, and that led to a real depreciation. So here I'm showing the nominal exchange rate for this period. So it was a crawling peg, it was a fixed exchange rate. And since the mid-80s, they decided to increase the exchange rate at huge steps, like higher steps than before. So here I'm showing the real exchange rate. So this is the real appreciation I was mentioning due to a coffee boom, and then there was a huge real depreciation. So inflation during this period, it was high and persistent, between 20 and 30%, but it never went above 32%. I think this number is this number. Okay. So in 1982, which was a tough year in general for Latin American countries, for Colombia, it was also a tough year relative to its history, but in this year, even GDP grew at a positive rate. And one of the reasons why Colombia might have escaped from this huge crisis in Latin America was that because of the coffee boom, Colombia only borrowed from abroad for a short period of time. So basically, there wasn't a high level of debt to default on as other Latin American countries. So that also explains why during this period foreign debt remained low. But there was a huge banking crisis in Colombia, and the central bank was in charge of bailing out some of the commercial banks that went bankrupt in this crisis, which is one of the reasons why there was a lot of monetary emission.
The region of the banking crisis was
Debt, foreign debt, but it was private. It wasn't public. Exactly. Yeah, the central bank bailed those banks out, bailed its debt.
You have those numbers included in the measure of the deficit?
Yes, they're included here. Yeah, that's might be one of the reasons of this big jump.
so there are private banks taking debt from the foreign economy just to lend it to the country, to the private sector. So it's a bailout from the private sector.
It's a bailout for the private sector, yeah. But the central bank did that bailout.
Sure, when one looks in these countries on the central bank, how does it show up when they bail out, say when they do
How they show up in the balance sheet? You mean?
from the US, we are very used to the US sort of looking at a central bank and we more or less think that we understand assets and liabilities. How does it show up or is very specific in each country, you need to look a lot? I mean, how would it show up in terms of the,
Or what?
so if they bail a bank, what would they do like it?
So so the bailing out in this case in Colombia was that the central bank paid for the foreign debt and basically exchanged, so basically bought dollars in the central bank used pesos to buy their debt in dollars.
What is it they buy from the commercial banks? It will look like that.
The typical situation is the private companies start to have debt in dollars. So when some devaluation happens, the people can pay the debt. So the government has a problem in terms of the balance sheet. So in that moment, the bank has a problem and maybe can grow. So this is the moment when the central bank intervene the process and have into account the problems on the balance sheet of the
No, it was a question of accounting. How would it show up?
So I guess so they're buying the debt, they're paying for the debt. So I guess it will show.
You're not paying for the debt because the debt has some maturity, I presume.
Would it show up like an exchange rate in swaps for exchange rates that they're basically losing money? I know that in other countries that's the way it show up, but I'm trying to think about there is a way to more systematic.
Yeah, more systematic. Yeah. So no. So I don't know. So I mean, from what I understand from this operation, so what it was, the central bank paid for the debt, for the foreign debt, right, and exchanged that for pesos, right. So that would show like the liability increased because there were more pesos printed, and I guess in the asset side, I mean, I don't know.
It's not that obvious. In Argentina, the way it worked is there was an insurance for an exchange. There was a bunch of private debt, and that private debt start maturing, say, over time.
They will pay for a swap out of the,
And it appears in your accounts only when the maturity.
when the day matures, then the central bank is on the wrong side of the currency swap.
Okay, I see.
I'm just wondering how is it
That's one example of it.
Then it should appear as the central bank losing money. That's very clear in the case of Chile. That they had a similar crisis also at the same time. So then because these operations means that you're losing quite a bit of money. Okay. In the case of Chile, then the treasury issued a bond and to make transfers to the central bank during 2 consecutive periods. But then it doesn't necessarily show up, depending on how they actually do it, you do not see that in the figures for the deficit. Because these bonds are issued after that thing happens. So when they go to Congress to pass the budget, these numbers are not there. So that's a mechanic. So that's why I was asking whether these transfers are they should arise in the transfer.
Okay, I see.
But it would be important to try to get to the details on how the accounting was done on the particular bailout.
Okay.
See, now, but this is a more general point.
Yes.
Juan Pablo, because we found this in some other countries too. We're going to need to come up with something that we specify as the ideal accounting system. Okay. And then sometimes you can do nothing because there's not sufficient data, but you can at least note variations from that.
Okay. No, what I'm going to do is, as a first step, is just to have these calculations as the change in money supply and change in debt, just to see, at least to begin with, as a robustness check. But okay, and I'll take a look at this, how this bailout actually happened, specifically how it happened.
Because I mean, for the interpretation of what will be the implication for money, is that it's not that this money is going to come back. It's not that this is a transitory increase on the money supply.
No.
These guys are, this is just it. They gave this transfer, and then it's just a way that shows up in budgets. It's kind of very murky because it's sometimes it's some sort of marketing instrument, sometimes it's so that's a part that it would be nice to
go into it too. Yeah, okay. I'll look into it too, into that bailout. My guess is that, no, I don't know. I'll go into it. Yeah.
No, but you see, like Felipe, when he talks next, this was something a lot of people in Mexico were saying was that, the problem in Mexico is that the losses of the development banks were not counted in the budget, but that was really part of the deficit. Now, unless you've changed what you're doing, Felipe, it's not that's right. But it's not big enough to change the whole picture. Of course, it alters the curves, but it doesn't change the picture. But Fernando, that's what we want to do. We want to have something like, okay, here is a definition of the deficit and the debt that says inclusive as possible.
Okay. So, and the last period we analyzed begins in 1991. In this period, financing was mainly done through domestic debt, and it begins with a new constitution. And this period also includes, in the middle, the worst economic crisis we had in the 20th century, which was 1999. So this period begins with the new constitution, and that meant very important changes for the central bank. So the first one was the monetary board ceased to exist, and in its place there was a board of directors. So the board of directors, the members of the board of directors are 5 guys whose job is just being there. The 6th one is the head of the central bank, and the 7th one is the minister of finance. So there's only one government representative there, although the members of the board of directors are chosen by the government. But in a given period, a president can only choose 2 members of the board. So in a given period, the government has maximum 3 guys who could align with the government. Well, the other big changes was that it became difficult to lend to the government. It became difficult in the sense that in order for the central bank to be able to lend directly to the government, it has to be a unanimous decision by the board of directors. But it became prohibited to lend to the private sector. So one of the other big changes economically with the new constitution was what we call la apertura, so the big opening of the economy. So with this big opening, the capital account was liberalized. And also one important change was that beginning in 1991, there could be foreign banks. Before 1991, foreigners could not own banks in Colombia. After 1991, we got Citibank and Santander and all the international banks. With respect to the government, with the constitution also, the transfers for the regional governments had to increase as well. And also, beginning in 1993, there was also a reform in the health system. So that also increased even further the transfers from the central government to the local governments. So in Colombia, how it works is that the central government determines the policy, but the ones that take the policy, that do the actual policy, are the local governments. So the central bank establishes how much money needs to go to the health sector, sends the money to the local governments, and the local governments are the ones that spend it. So with this health reform in 1993, they were also increased the size, the expenditures of the government. And this is shown in this graph.
Also, like a tax reform, they add new taxes, they increase rates.
So what it did was, it became mandatory to have a health insurance. So since it became mandatory to have a health insurance, and not everybody could afford to have. So legally in Colombia, if you pay a legal wage, a percentage goes to your health, to the health insurance. But if you earn less than that, your health insurance is subsidized.
You're going to go from 10% of GDP to 20-something% of GDP. You either put new taxes or you increase the existing rates.
New taxes.
New taxes. Yeah. So it was VAT, income taxes.
So VAT increased, but income taxes. income taxes was the main thing with the health reform. And also the pension reform, so that's also like another tax there.
But it wasn't directly this, you know, in the United States, we pay for Medicaid, and Medicare, Medicaid, that's just a line. And you said there was a line like that here. They didn't increase that?
They established that. So begin 1993, now from the $100 you receive each month, 8 need to go towards your health insurance. So yeah, so the size of the government increased by more than 2 times. With respect to monetary and foreign exchange policy, things changed. So in the 90s, the crawling peg was abolished, and in its place, a moving band was established. So that means that the exchange rate could float freely within the boundaries of a band established by the central bank. And the monetary policy had as its target the growth of the monetary base. But since there was this moving band, the monetary policy depended on the foreign exchange policy. And with respect for and also in this period, there was an increase in fiscal deficit because the size of the government increased. And there was an increase in the current account deficit. So here this is the nominal exchange rate. So in 1991, the crawling peg was abolished. So in its place, there was this band established, and the exchange rate was allowed to float, in quotes, freely within the bands. But the bands were changed a couple of times. In the early 90s, as the current account deficit was increasing, they had to shift downwards their band, but then in the late 90s, they had to shift upwards the band a couple of times before they abolished it in 1999, sorry. And since 1999, then the exchange rate is allowed to float freely, although the central bank intervenes from time to time. So with respect to the real exchange rate, in the early 90s, was a real exchange appreciation as a lot of dollars were coming into the economy as the current account deficit was increasing. Then the late 90s was the opposite. And then since 1999, basically the real exchange rate moves hand in hand with the nominal exchange rate. Let me show you. So inflation this period is decreasing. One of the main reasons is that in the Constitution it was established explicitly that the objective of the central bank was to have a low inflation. At first, so they started to establish this objective of inflation in 1993, but it wasn't binding. Since 2003, it became binding in the sense that if the objective of inflation is not reached, then the head of the central bank has to go to Congress to explain what happened, as will happen this February, because this year it wasn't held. Since 2001, they established the first band for inflation, for the objective of inflation. So there's a specific objective of inflation, but there's a range within which the inflation can land, and it would be considered as if the objective of inflation was achieved. And this is established year by year. However, since 2010, the objective of inflation is what in 2001 was determined to be the long-term objective, which is 3%. So nowadays the objective is 3%, and the band is between 2 and 4%. So in this period, the main source of financing was through domestic debt. One of the reasons for this is because in the mid-90s, the domestic government debt market was developed. And additionally, especially since 1999, the interbank market has become deeper. So in this graph, I'm showing, so the blue line is domestic debt. It was the main source of financing. That doesn't mean that there weren't other sources. In particular, foreign debt also increased, but the main source was domestic debt.
I don't believe the delta M over Y. This is the period when you had from 25% inflation to 6% inflation. So I bet money was growing, and I bet you were collecting similar.
Yeah, but since 1991, the only resources that the central bank could send to the central government were its profits.
But when you have 20% a year inflation, the profits of the central bank are huge.
But there was also...
You made pretty good conferences with that.
Look at T over Y. So My hypothesis is that they moved through 3 different accounting systems.
Oh, I
See, early on, they had T over Y, just what by definition was 0,
Okay.
and they imputed M over Y, not using money data,
But
but just
using-
whatever it had to be.
Yeah, we have to go and dig into what these guys.
No, I know what this guy did here. You mean before? Sorry. I know what happens here. Why this T is not 0 here. That I know. And the reason is because in 2001, so this is according to some standard that the IMF established. So in this T, what is included in this T is income from privatizations and from concessions, and something like accrued liabilities. And but they took that back to 1990.
Yes, no. So the IMF came in and said you have to change your accounting system. So what we need to do is kind of get a hold of that, the change in accounting systems.
How do you guys think about off the books future promises? Like, imagine you were doing this for the U.S. and you didn't have a way of counting all the future Social Security
And Medicare and Medicaid.
right?
Yeah.
And Social Security, the unfunded parts. I mean, you might think the goal of your measurement system is to match whatever the debt is, because in the end, if they issued the debt, that was the the residual that ended up financing stuff. But if you're missing all the future implicit stuff, then that's not even right.
No, for the future, so the way we're thinking about it is in 1980 something, there were these future stuff that would show up, but you could not see it in 84. But then when 92 came in, the government had to issue bonds to take care of that thing. And then when you look at the debt, you cannot really account for the debt just by looking at the deficits year by year, because you have these special things that show up, like when you bail out the banking sector. That's why we are interpreting the transfers as that component. And then we're trying
but your basic model is, if the debt hasn't had to be issued yet to pay for it, it doesn't count.
We're not going to see it. We're not going to see exactly. We're not going to see it now.
I guess that's reasonable, but
No, but and we should we have to discuss it.
Yeah.
And even provide some numbers. But when you start looking at this for the United States, as you know, exactly how you account for that, because it requires projections of future growth and so forth, the numbers can be all over the place.
yeah.
So this T over Y. Delta M. Profits from the central bank. Yes. I mean, it's more what we're defining to be monetary emission in this period. Yeah. I mean, so in the budget constraint, there's an MT minus 1.
Well, that's called profits over Y.
Yeah.
But then, how is it the central bank? So what's going on during this time? Why is it making no profits? So just explain again.
So it could be, here's the thing. So the thing, if it's positive, it's constant money emission. If it's negative, so if the central bank has losses, this 0 here in this graph means that there were 0 profits from the central bank. 0 profits transferred from the central bank to the government. 0 resources transferred from the central bank to the government.
But basically, the government is accumulating assets.
Yes.
The treasury or whatever, I don't know how to call it, but the rest of the government is accumulating assets on the central bank, which at this part, they cannot be called assets because they cannot be called profits because it's not allowed to.
No, I understand. No, what I'm saying is that this number is the profits. This number is the money that went from the central bank to the government. This is the number. So why was this 0? Because there's if in case the bank doesn't have profits but rather losses, this wouldn't be negative. This would appear on a different account in the government.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but there's some funny accounting here we need to understand.
Okay.
No, David, it's not just that there's funny accounting. It seems like there were at least 3 different systems, inconsistent systems of accounting over this 1963 to 2012 we're looking at.
Yes. We realize that we've been trying.
In lots of cases, there's nothing you're going to be able to do about it, but we're going to have to discuss it. Yeah. And the delta M over Y, as I was saying before, you can get an independent measure of that.
Yeah.
Like delta M over Y.
Yeah, like delta M over Y. Exactly.
if M increases, so if M1 increases, I mean, that's, yeah, there are more pesos being printed, but that isn't going to the government.
No, but eventually, who's
eventually,
gonna get it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Unless they go after
No.
someone
Does
runs
the
out.
central bank have audited
No,
financial
this is
statements?
that theory.
Yes,
Come on, what's
exactly.
it called in public in industrial organization? The Average-Johnson effect or whatever. You have a regulated industry that has a regulated profit. What they do is just build like new bank buildings. They do all kinds of stuff like that.
But at the end,
Conferences.
Yeah.
The consulting money at the Minneapolis Fed,
For instance.
for instance. I didn't say that. Anyway, let's keep going.
Okay. How much
But no,
time?
I mean, but something happened with the money. It couldn't have been zero. Yes, what they
Okay.
transferred to the central government could have been zero.
Yeah, but then wouldn't the important part be how much the central bank is transferring to the central government? Because that means that's why we're graphing this part.
Yeah, but then as Fernando says,
What happens?
give it a different name.
Yeah, call it products. Don't call it
Part
change
of
of
the
base.
part of the positive side of the transfers is because you are including the variation of the monetary base inside the transfer.
This change, this includes,
In the first part, when you have the delta n zero variation, so this is a part. You are underestimated, in my opinion, the sources for the model.
so you're saying that this green line would be, but this green line is different things. This green line in this case is, after the 90s, the central government started selling assets. That will be included in this green line, for instance. So it's not income from the central bank at all, or from monetary issues at all.
But the monetary base is growing.
Yes.
Where in the model, in your figures,
No, that's the point. Like,
that is the point. So since I can't see that in the model, in your version, in my opinion, part of the positive value of the transfers is because you have there inside of the positive value of the transfers that are accounted or not. At the end of the day,
no, I mean, that's what Tim is saying. It goes to some other expenses.
Yeah.
Counter expenses.
But those expenses presumably are then not counted in government expenditures. So,
But if you count it as assets, right?
you're accumulating assets, that's right.
Or they were transferred with creative
Market
accounts.
buildings.
maybe
Not
the
through
treasury is accumulating reserves.
no, okay. So I'm just going to include then. I'm doing this for later. So in this project, what we see is that Colombia had macro stability. Yeah, but this other part will take more than 10 minutes, so I'd rather conclude here. So what we see here in this project is that Colombia had some macro stability, at least relative to other Latin American countries. One reason was because,
So this goes up to right now, no? I mean, these profits is kind of very small.
No, they start moving, but then they go back to zero. Yeah.
They go back to zero.
yes,
Yeah, that's
Basically, this is just the central bank cannot the mandate is that they are not supposed to finance the government.
exactly.
And
The only-
then, but then there is some natural increase, even at this time with the price stability of GDP, total GDP. So there is some seniorage, and I guess they kind of keep it with them.
For the central bank, yes.
So, but you have,
So this is, here,
like after 2000, there is something positive there that could account for that. These guys are having 4%
But after
inflation.
2005, it looks like it's very small.
no, this is actually, and this is zero because it actually was negative, but it wouldn't be accounted as negative. So it appears in another account of the government.
So this still doesn't seem to me to make any connection between sort of what we think of as, Kuznets and we talk about what's going on in the United States. You're looking at investment and consumption and how much goes to government and all this real stuff. Now, of course, there's connections between all this monetary trickery and real stuff, but somehow you're just missing that. What's going on in Colombia?
Yeah, or maybe a different way to put it is, if you told me you were going to look at a country for 50 years and it hadn't had like a crisis every 4 years, I'd do the production function or the supply side, and I'd do F of K and L and guess that, it'd be that. I wouldn't have thought that the hypothesis that you guys are entertaining would be the natural one. It makes sense if you think there's a crisis every 7 years that you got nothing to do with the
What does
growth
the crisis
account.
mean? It mean people are going hungry, or does it mean some big shot lost his shirt?
I'm guessing you're like not on some frontier, you know, you're super inefficient, but
No, but so.
like if you gave Solo the Colombia, he wouldn't be doing any of this.
No, but show us your picture at the very beginning. Just flip back to it fast. I
Which
mean,
picture?
I'm not good at calculating, but what's the average? What's the average growth rate? And okay, there's GDP per capita, and what is it, 2%? The growth? So what's going on is no catch up. It's probably just the same as the US on average. There's no catch up. And here's a hypothesis. I don't want to get in trouble. I have no idea if the Americans in the room, if I'm the only Democrat or what, but maybe they don't have enough infrastructure. Maybe they're not spending enough.
Which is a fact.
Right?
Yeah, that's a fact.
Maybe we need more highways and bridges and
Yeah, productivity is very low.
communications.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a hypothesis. Because, see, that was a beautiful way you did the hypothesis at the beginning, David, but you never got back to any answers on it.
Now, is that so? But this is so. The point is, what we see, at least until 1991, is at the moment. Sorry, the hypothesis is that there was a lot of financial repression. Money, exactly. Couldn't get the money. The central bank was printing pesos, but that wasn't going to a real sector. Why? Because at the same time that the central bank was printing pesos, it was increasing the reserve requirements. We see it, well, at least until in the period we think that it would play a bigger role, which is from 1963 to 1991. I don't know how clear this, so in this graph I'm showing, the blue line is the growth of the monetary base, and the red line is the change in the money multiplier. So at the times when the monetary base increased the most were the times where the change in the money multiplier decreased. So it was basically, yeah, it was printing more pesos, but I'm going to choke the banks, so the commercial banks, so those pesos do not reach the economy. So that would be the hypothesis. We have to look a little bit more into that. There was financial repression, and that's consistent with not having, let's say, hyperinflation, and also consistent with having low growth, or at least not the growth you would expect for having low volatility. And I think I'll conclude with that.